There have been a lot of protests in the world this year and right now, but I think the reason there's so much focus on Hong Kong is because it's firstly on the front line of the debate about China's role in the world and China's influence on the world and democracy versus totalitarianism. It's absolutely on the front line of that. Also, in a year, we have seen Hong Kong go from a prosperous um, beacon of growth and prosperity and relative freedom to basically at some points looking like a war zone without wanting to get into hyperbole. It just seems the situation is getting worse and worse and worse. I've just seen an interview on CNN with Anson Chan, the former chief secretary, not chief executive, and she talked a lot of sense from what I could see. She was saying that there really will be a need at some point for a path to reconciliation because the society is getting so divided that it's going to take a long time for Hong Kong to get out of this. She was saying that there needs to be an inquiry looking at the whole situation, police brutality, but also the role of the protesters to establish the facts on both sides. The latest development is that the Polytechnic building, the University Polytechnic building, I don't know the formal name of the institution, has been surrounded by police basically, and it seems like there's a standoff going on. So they're waiting for students to come out to arrest them, and it's a very, very tense situation. Um, Over the last sort of 2 months, it's clear that the violence has very much escalated. And whilst I have been clear from the start that my sympathies lie 100% with the Hong Kong protest movement, I'm not going to say that I agree with every tactic that they're using because there are some tactics I think are seriously damaging the movement. And irrefutably, there has been some violence from protesters. I think the problem here is neither side is backing down. I don't think it's a level playing field. I think that we're talking about mostly teenage protesters versus a quasi superpower. It's not a level playing field, but the violence, the vandalism that has been coming from the protest movement really is not helping matters. And that doesn't downplay or mitigate the police brutality and the fact that, peaceful protests. It shouldn't be forgotten that back in July, August, there were massive, massive protests that were overwhelmingly peaceful. Chinese state media just ignored that. So the anger against Chinese state media, the likes of Xinhua, I think is understandable because they have totally distorted the situation. Um, there's many pieces of misinformation going on out there. One of them is that Western media is totally biased towards the protesters. Well, I've just watched a CNN report, and their correspondent clearly said that there is a hardcore violent aspect among the protesters. They are reporting that. Contrast that with Chinese state media, which will totally ignore police brutality, totally ignore the violence against unarmed protesters. CGTN and Xinhua totally ignored the attack on unarmed protesters on the Hong Kong metro system a few months back by triad thugs, most likely under the influence of Beijing. So when it comes to truth, I'll never trust the Communist Party. They've just got too much of a track record of industrial scale lies. But I think it is a stretch to say that the violent incidents are just like being manufactured by Beijing to make the movement look bad. I think there is a hardcore element, and some of this is getting very ugly. I heard about a pro-Beijing man arguing with a mass protester who was set on fire. I heard about an elderly man who had a brick hit his head. You know, there is absolutely no way to condone incidents like that, and the more moderate aspects of the protest movement need to make their voice heard and say, we're not going to condone that either. Because it's going to be difficult for the British government to actually take a position of saying we wholeheartedly support the protest movement if there is violent acts from some protesters. Because then Beijing will just say, oh, look, the British are stoking up this unrest. What we should say is there needs to be an independent inquiry into police brutality, and that the threats that the Beijing regime are making, for example, about shattering bones, Xi Jinping's words, are absolutely intolerable and absolutely violating the Sino-British Joint Declaration, because that is the fundamental problem here. So to blame the protesters, as I've seen some people doing, for the crisis that Hong Kong is in, mitigates the fact that this was a crisis the Carrie Lam administration started with her extradition bill, and the fact that she has utterly refused to, for example, order an independent inquiry, call for police restraint, or anything of that matter. And Beijing is escalating this just as much as the violent core of protesters. For example, sending in the PLA, on the surface it was just to clean up, but where do you draw the line? This is a point Anton Chan made. Where do you draw the line? At what point they then just volunteer to help the police and because they become a paramilitary essentially? All that's going to do is anger the situation, fuel to the situation. But those students who, or they may not all be students, those protesters who are taking bows and arrows, who are, gluing bricks to roads, vandalizing buildings, no matter how angry you feel, it's not going to help the situation, and it's going to polarize a lot of people who might otherwise be sympathetic. I saw one interview with a mainland student who actually said that he was sympathetic to the protest movement at the start, but he's changed his mind because of the violence. And, as much as there has been examples of mainland students bullying their peers here in the UK, in my view, they need to be expelled from British universities. Two wrongs don't make a right. And mainland students who are fleeing Hong Kong, that's not something to glorify. That's not good. That they fear for their safety. Um, this is a very, very bad situation. And what I would say to the protesters is this: I totally, totally understand your anger. And I will always back democracy over communism. Always. But vandalizing buildings and using violence isn't going to help matters. And it's not good enough to say, oh, well, the police are brutal, so we'll just be brutal back. The world's watching. And all that's going to do is play into Chinese state media. That's my concern. It's already happening. You just look at Xinhua or CGTN. Their line is, oh, look at these terrorists. Look at these rioters. And terrorist is a very strong word, but it's hard to argue against the riot a bit. Vandalizing and throwing Molotov cocktails at the police, then that's what it is. But by the same token, when you hear reports of female protesters being gang raped in police stations and situations like this, there is real brutality on that side as well. Once the pride of Asia, the Hong Kong police have become a byword for police brutality. Um, so this is really a situation that's getting out of control. Um, and I think moderate protesters really need to, like Joshua Wong, people like that who have influence within the movement, although the movement has no central leadership, they need to be very careful what they're saying. And they need to be, if they're going to endorse violence, it's going to be difficult for foreign governments to openly back that, even if it's a small segment of the overall movement. Um, that's my concern. I think that some of these young protesters are so entrenched in their goals here of standing up against the police and the Lam administration, they're starting to lose common sense. And violence, whatever angle you look at it in this situation, is not going to help. Now, I'm not a pacifist. If someone's being beaten by the police, I totally support them defending themselves. But the orchestrated attacks and vandalizing Chinese businesses is just stupid. They're not police, they're not armed. They're not senior CCP members. They're just ordinary people. It's incredibly stupid. It's like the Extinction Rebellion thing here in the UK. That hasn't got most of the public on side. All it's done is irritated people in a very big way. And I think the situation in Hong Kong is that a very large number of Hong Kongers were very angry about the extradition bill. They took part in those protests earlier in the year, but I think a lot of people now really do want to return to some degree of normality. Um, by all means, there needs to be continued, pushing and scrutiny and pressure on the Lam administration, and there should be international um, condemnation of what's going on. And I think tactics can be taken or approaches can be taken. For example, issuing overseas British citizenship to Hong Kongers who want to seek refuge here. There's a lot of things we can do. I think we could be a lot more outspoken about China, particularly China's role in undermining Western democracies. For all China's claims of victimhood, it's been trying to undermine Western democracy for years by, for example, stoking up overseas students with nationalism. So part of me thinks, yeah, now they're getting a bit of their own medicine. China's been doing this for years, not on the same scale, but they've been stoking up overseas students with nationalist sentiments for years, bullying their peers, waving the Chinese flag in other countries. Now that there's resentment within de facto within China, it's they're getting a bit of their own medicine in a sense. But I'm never going to condone rioters setting a guy on fire or throwing a stone at an old man. That is just as wrong as a girl getting raped in a police station or unarmed protesters getting beaten. Two wrongs don't make a right. And at some point, the movement needs to use common sense. I am concerned that this hardcore element, they are extreme because they're even attacking people who agree with them if they don't agree with their tactics. They're actually behaving like the Red Guards in the 60s, ironically. So, as someone who despises the CCP and their lies, and you just have to look at CGTN and Xinhua to see the distortion that's going on. Um, with that being said, there is an aspect of this movement that I really think is not helping matters, the violent aspect. So that's my thoughts on the situation, and I just don't know where this is going. The only way this is going to calm down is when reasonable people on both sides start to rein in. Now, I think the police have been totally out of hand. I think they have used excess force throughout this, and that's only angered the protesters. So then, it's fueled the situation. That still doesn't mean that it's going to make things better simply, by firing bows and arrows at the police or setting, I mean, this thing in the university, setting the entrance on fire. If nothing else, that's just plain stupid. That's putting your own lives in danger. I don't understand that at all. I mean, it's crazy. They're only endangering their own lives. So I'll round this up, but it's a very, very grave situation. And if there's another Tiananmen style massacre, I don't think it'll happen like that. I think it'll be gradual. But the world's watching. That's why it's so, so important that the protesters are responsible in what they're doing, because it's going to be difficult for the rest of the world to openly and vociferously back them if there is violent aspects. That's how I see it. Because then China will just turn around and say, "Oh, the West is funding rioting," and it's a very bad situation. Hong Kong's went into a recession, and it's looking like a war zone. So really, if you are a protester, if you are a student in Hong Kong, I totally, totally sympathise with your anger. I really do. I mean, I'm angry and I'm not even living there, but I've just seen the latest headline is Hong Kong firefighters criticise police force. So there is definitely, serious ground for charges to be made against the police, and they need to be held accountable. But this needs to de-escalate.